The fluorescent lights hummed their electric lullaby above the ICU, a sound Hannah Clarke had learned to breathe through like seasoned soldiers breathe through mortar fire, as background noise to survival. Norfolk nights at Seattle General felt different from the Baghdad nights, but the underlying rhythm was identical, monitors beeping in staggered patterns, ventilators wheezing their mechanical breath, the soft rubber-soled shuffle of nurses moving between the dying and the barely alive. She pushed the medication cart down the corridor at 2,247 hours, her movements economical, practiced, invisible. No one turned to watch her pass. That was intentional. Room 12 occupied the corner of the east wing, and Hannah approached it with the same measured pace she used for everything, the pace of someone who had learned that rushing draws attention, and attention was a liability she could not afford. Major William Cross lay on the hospital bed, his chest wrapped in gauze, his left shoulder bandaged with the careful precision of someone who understood that shrapnel wounds did not forgive carelessness. He had arrived 3 days ago via military transport, medevaced from Tikrit with wounds that required specialized care. The Pentagon had made 3 phone calls before he was admitted. Hannah knew this because the Pentagon had briefed her 18 months ago, and this was the patient she had been embedded here to monitor. She did not acknowledge the briefing when she looked at him. She did not acknowledge the 10th Special Forces group patch that was sewn, carefully, deliberately, invisibly, into the lining of her white coat. Acknowledgement was betrayal. "Good evening, Major," she said, her voice in the register she had perfected over the past year and a half, deferential, soft, the voice of someone who had learned the anatomy of invisibility and had memorized every nerve. "I'm here to check your dressing." "May I?" The Major nodded. His eyes followed her as she approached, and she felt the weight of his attention the way soldiers feel the weight of surveillance through a rifle scope. She did not meet his gaze. Not yet. Not in a way that would register. Hannah pulled the curtain around the bed, enclosing them in a small fortress of striped fabric and recycled air. Her hands moved to the gauze at his shoulder with the precision of someone who had done this under conditions far less sanitary, far more urgent, with shrapnel still singing through the air above her head. 3-layer technique. First layer, fine mesh gauze with antibiotic ointment, placed directly against the wound to prevent adhesion. Second layer, absorbent gauze pads to catch the seeping blood and serous fluid that came from the body's attempt to heal itself. Third layer, waterproof backing to protect the dressing from the harsh reality of shower water and careless hands. She had learned this technique in a field hospital in Fallujah, working beside a trauma surgeon whose name she had never learned and whose death she had heard about 6 months later through a radio crackling with static. The Major watched her hands move across his shoulder. The fluorescent light above caught the thin white scars that traced across her forearms, souvenirs from flying glass, from explosions, from the sharp edges of the world when the world broke open. She should have covered them. She never did. "That's field hospital work," the Major said. His voice came out low, hoarse from intubation, from the tubes that had been shoved down his throat to keep him alive during transport. "I've seen that suture pattern before." Hannah's hand stilled for exactly 1 breath. 1 breath was the difference between a slip and composure. 1 breath was the distance between exposure and survival. She did not look at him. She continued working, her movements flowing into the next step as though he had said nothing at all. The dressing sealed. The edges taped. The small metal clips that held the wrapping in place clicked into position with the finality of a weapon being locked and loaded. "I trained at Johns Hopkins," she said, and the lie moved through the air with the smooth confidence of something rehearsed 1,000 times. "They emphasize attention to detail. Johns Hopkins doesn't teach you to work around shrapnel fragments like you're defusing a bomb," the Major said. His eyes held hers for exactly 1 second, 1 dangerous second, and she saw recognition move across his face like a shadow passing over water. He knew. He had served long enough to recognize the particular kind of precision that came from working under fire, that came from the body's muscle memory burning itself into the nervous system through repetition and adrenaline and the knowledge that a mistake meant someone's death. Hannah's eyes locked on his for that single suspended moment, and then she snapped the mask back into place. Her face smoothed. Her shoulders relaxed into the posture of a civilian nurse rather than the posture of a soldier. She was no longer the person who had moved through her military career with the fluid grace of apex predators hunting in coordinated silence. She was Hannah Clarke, RN, registered nurse, invisible, deferential, the kind of woman who faded into the background of other people's lives. "Rest well, Major," she said. Her voice had returned to its soft register. "I'll be back to check on you in 2 hours." She did not wait for a response. She did not see the way his eyes followed her as she left the room, the way his jaw tightened with the knowledge of what he had just seen, the way his hand moved to touch the dressing she had just applied with the kind of skill that could not be taught in nursing school, only learned in the field. The 10th Special Forces group patch sat in the lining of her jacket, sewn there with deliberate stitches by someone whose name she had never asked, someone who understood that certain kinds of identity had to be hidden in plain sight. The patch felt heavier when she stepped back into the corridor. It always did. Hannah moved through the rest of her rounds with the same practiced invisibility. Vitals on room 10, a 63-year-old woman recovering from abdominal surgery, stable, breathing well, scheduled for discharge tomorrow. Room 11 contained a teenager with a compound fracture of the tibia, already asleep, pain medication keeping him in that gentle distance where the body could begin its work of assembly and repair. Room 9 held an older gentleman whose kidneys were beginning the slow process of failing, and she adjusted his for fluids with the kind of certainty that came from understanding the chemistry of the body the way other people understood the chemistry of coffee. The nurse's station sat at the intersection of 3 hallways, positioned so that anyone standing there could monitor all the rooms on this wing. It was a position of power that looked like an administrative necessity. Hannah pulled up a stool at 2,347 hours and opened the supply inventory log. The numbers on the page should have been familiar. She had been here for 18 months, had reviewed these logistics a dozen times, but something had shifted. Or perhaps nothing had shifted, and she was simply reading the data more carefully now. Surgical gauze. Case of 96 units, priced at $847 per case. Standard market rate for hospital-grade sterile gauze, $280 per case. She traced her finger across the line, the mathematics as clear as a bullet wound in ballistic gel. The hospital was paying 3 times market rate. Not 2 times. 3 times. I'd put that down if I were you. Hannah did not look up. She did not tense. She simply turned the page of the inventory log back to the section covering ordinary medical tape and saline solution, items that were priced with the kind of brutal honesty that made no one curious. Dr. Pierce stood at the edge of the nurse's station, his shadow falling across the desk in a way that suggested he had positioned himself there deliberately, the way a hunter positions himself downwind. He wore the kind of confidence that came from a medical degree that cost $280,000 and a family trust fund that cost considerably more. His tie was silk. His watch was a Rolex that caught the fluorescent light and threw it back into the world like a small, expensive star. She had seen his medical school diploma in the hallway outside his office during her first week here, Yale School of Medicine, graduated 2008 with high honors. Just reviewing the supplies, Hannah said, and her voice had returned to that soft register, that carefully constructed architecture of humility and deference. Making sure we haven't missed anything. The supplies are my responsibility, Dr. Pierce said. His voice was the voice of a man who had never had to raise it because the mere act of speaking was always understood to carry the weight of consequence. I'd prefer you focus on nursing. Of course, Doctor. Hannah closed the inventory log. She did not apologize. She had learned that apologies drew more attention than simple compliance. She simply set the pen down and stood, angling her body away from the desk in a way that communicated availability, subordination, the absence of any agenda beyond the next vital sign check. Dr. Pierce watched her for a moment longer. She felt his attention the way a rabbit feels the attention of a hawk circling overhead. His eyes moved across the pages she had been reading, the numbers still visible on the screen, and something shifted in his expression, a tightening around the eyes, a compression of the jaw that lasted less than a second before his face smoothed again. Patient in room 12 is comfortable, he asked. The question seemed casual, but there was a current moving beneath it, something with teeth. Stable vitals, Hannah said. No signs of infection. The dressing's holding well. Good. Dr. Pierce turned to leave, then paused. Keep it that way. Major Cross is VIP status. I want his care handled personally. No cross-training, no overlap with the regular floor staff. You can manage that, I'm sure. It was not a request. It was a command wrapped in the kind of language that made it sound like a favor, the way a knife wrapped in silk was still a knife. Hannah nodded, and Dr. Pierce walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor with the particular kind of confidence that comes from a man who has never had his authority questioned. She waited until his shadow disappeared around the corner. Then she opened the inventory log again, memorizing the numbers, burning the pattern of inflated costs into her memory the way soldiers burn exit routes and guard rotations into neural pathways that operate beneath conscious thought. 3 times market rate. Someone was moving money through the medical supply chain. Someone was very comfortable doing it. And someone, she turned toward the hallway, toward room 12, toward the major who had recognized her hands and her precision and the very particular knowledge that came from operating under fire, someone had just noticed that she had noticed. The lights hummed above her, indifferent, eternal, the sound of institutions continuing to function long after the individuals within them had become expendable. The room went dead silent when Dr. Pierce entered. Hannah was finishing the wound dressing on Major Cross's chest, her hands moving with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this under mortar fire. The Major's sister stood nearby, clutching her purse, watching the careful layers of gauze come together with practiced efficiency. Pierce stopped at the foot of the bed. He didn't acknowledge the sister. He didn't nod at the Major. His eyes locked on Hannah's work, the sterile field, the suture pattern, the exact 3-layer technique that field hospitals used when complications could cost a life. This is substandard wound care, Clarke, Pierce said. His voice carried down the hallway, loud enough that 2 orderlies paused at the nursing station. Did they not teach basic sterile technique wherever you trained? The sister's face flushed. She looked from Pierce to Hannah, uncertainty flickering across her features like a question mark. Hannah took one measured breath. Just one. She secured the final tape strip, her movements neither rushed nor slow. Then a single tear escaped her eye. She didn't hide it. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, her jaw tight, her hand steady as a surgical laser. The wound is healing ahead of schedule, Doctor, Hannah said. Her voice was flat. Professional. The voice of someone stating observable facts while the world rearranged itself around her. Pierce turned to the sister. I'll have a competent nurse redo this. He left before Hannah could respond, his shoes clicking against the tile floor with the rhythm of a man who had just planted a flag on territory he considered conquered. The Major's eyes followed Hannah as she began removing her gloves. His breathing had accelerated slightly, she could see it in the rise and fall of his bare chest. He wanted to say something. She could feel the weight of recognition pressing against her cover like a physical force. She met his gaze for one dangerous second, a look that said everything without words, do not acknowledge what you know. Do not acknowledge me. Then her professional mask slipped back into place. She documented the wound assessment in his chart. She checked his vitals. She left the room without another glance. But as she walked past the supply closet at the end of the corridor, she felt the weight of the faded 10th Special Forces group patch sewn inside her jacket lining. The patch was worn from 18 months of being pressed against her ribs in a room where no one knew what it meant. In Tikrit, it had meant command. It had meant authority. Here at Seattle General in Norfolk, it meant exposure. Every time Dr. Pierce looked at her the wrong way, the patch felt heavier. Every time she ate alone in the break room, it dug into her skin like a reminder that she was living a lie that was beginning to crack. The next day at lunch, Hannah entered the break room with her tray. Egg salad sandwich, an apple, lukewarm coffee in a paper cup. For nurses were scattered around the small table, Reyes, Mitchell, Jackson, the new rotation from the night shift. They saw her enter. Their conversation died like a light switch flipped off. Within 30 seconds, they had abandoned their meals and filed out, their excuses dissolving like antiseptic on skin. Oh, I forgot I had a chart to check. Gotta take that call. Break's over already. Hannah sat alone under buzzing fluorescent lights. The hum was steady, mechanical, indifferent, the sound of an institution continuing to function long after the individuals within it had become expendable. She ate her sandwich in silence. The egg salad tasted like cardboard. The apple was mealy. She didn't taste any of it. That wasn't the worst part. On Friday afternoon, Pierce posted a disciplinary write-up on the unit board where everyone passed. The document was printed and laminated, official and permanent as a scar. Written warning. Employee, Clarke, H. Violation, insubordination and failure to follow physician directives. Details: Clarke has repeatedly questioned departmental procurement processes without authorization. Clarke has failed to comply with supervisory directives regarding wound care protocol. Outcome: further violations will result in immediate termination. 37 people would walk past that board that day. 37 people would read her name. 37 people would think, she's on thin ice. Stay away from her. That afternoon, Pierce cornered her near the supply closet. The hallway was empty except for the rhythm of a distant code being called somewhere in the hospital. He kept his voice low this time, but low was somehow worse than loud. Low was calculated. "You're a liability, Nightingale," he said, using the nickname with a kind of contempt that turned words into weapons. "Every mistake you make reflects on this department. Every time you step out of line, every time you question things that aren't your business, it affects all of us." Hannah met his eyes. The tears from 2 days ago had been real, not from fear, but from the particular kind of rage that comes from being forced to swallow your authority like poison and smile like it was medicine. She'd held her composure for 18 months. She'd endured worse than this man's contempt in places where contempt could get you killed. She had one response in her, and it had been earned through 3 combat tours and 2 Purple Hearts and the faded patch that felt like it was burning through her ribs. "I've seen better men than you break under pressure, Doctor," she said quietly. The words landed like a scalpel. Precise. Bloodless. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry again. She simply stated something she knew to be true as fact. Pierce's jaw tightened. A muscle worked beneath his skin like something trying to escape. He opened his mouth, then closed it. She had said exactly enough to be insubordinate without crossing into something he could formally document as threatening. She had pulled the string and walked past him while he was still unraveling. At his desk later that afternoon, Pierce compiled a folder. 3 months of incident reports, some real, most fabricated from the pattern of a predator building a case. He had dates, times, alleged violations citing obscure regulations about unauthorized clinical judgment and failure to follow chain of command. He had recommendations from other physicians, all colleagues who owed him favors. He had a paper trail designed not just to terminate Hannah Clarke, but to erase her, to make her a cautionary tale whispered in the hallway for the next 6 months. Yeah, she was a good nurse, but she couldn't follow protocol. He scheduled a meeting with the hospital administrator for Monday morning. 9 a.m. sharp. By 9:15, he would present the folder. By 9:30, she would be escorted out by security. By 9:45, her credentials would be flagged in the system and she would be unemployable at any hospital within 200 miles of Norfolk. What Pierce didn't know was that Hannah had already received her termination notice in a text message from her handler at 2 a.m. that morning. Cross situation resolved. Medical fraud investigation closing. You're extracted in 48 hours. Maintain cover until then. She sat in her studio apartment that night, staring at her reflection in the dark window. The city lights blurred behind her like a watercolor painting someone had abandoned halfway through. Her coffee was cold. Her files, everything related to the investigation, every piece of evidence she had gathered about Pierce and the supply chain corruption, were encrypted on a flash drive in her boot. Tomorrow, her cover would collapse. Tomorrow, Pierce would walk into that administrator's office with his folder of fabrications. Tomorrow, one of the 2 of them would be erased from this story. What neither of them knew was that the erasure was already written into the script. They just didn't know who was going to disappear first. The monitor alarm screamed at 0200 like a siren wailing through a canyon. Room 12. The sound cut through the fluorescent hum of Seattle General's night shift, through the quiet clipboard shuffling, through the fragile rhythm of a hospital sleeping but never resting. Hannah's head came up from the nurse's station chart where she'd been documenting the evening medications, routine entries, invisible work, the kind of nursing nobody noticed unless something went wrong. Something had just gone catastrophically wrong. She moved before conscious thought caught up. 23 years of muscle memory, 3 deployments, 2 Purple Hearts, 1 identity that had to stay buried, all of it compressed into the simple act of standing and walking. Not running. Running looked panicked. Running looked like a nurse who didn't know what she was doing. She walked like someone who'd already seen the worst the human body could offer and had learned to move through crisis the way other people moved through grocery stores, with purpose, with precision, with the terrifying fluid grace of someone who understood that hesitation killed. The door to room 12 swung inward. Major James Cross lay on the bed with his chest caved inward on the left side like someone had pressed their fist through his ribcage and forgotten to remove it. His skin had turned the color of old bruises, dusky blue spreading like watercolor across his shoulders, his neck, creeping up toward his jaw. The ventilator beside his bed wasn't helping anymore. Nothing was helping. The air trapped in his chest cavity wasn't just collapsing his lung, it was crushing his heart, compressing the vessels that should have been carrying blood to his brain and his fingers and the hands that had held weapons in Tikrit and surgical instruments here in Norfolk. Dr. Ramesh stood frozen 6 feet from the bed, hands trembling at his sides, face pale enough to match the patient's. He was young, late 20s maybe, still new enough to the ER that life or death moment still felt impossible instead of inevitable. His lips moved without sound. His eyes darted between the monitor and the patient and the door, looking for someone who knew what to do, someone with authority, someone who could make this stop. His crashing, Ramesh whispered. Not a question. Not even a request. A statement of fact that seemed to paralyze him further. We need to page cardiothoracic. We need to call vascular. We need. No time. Hannah's voice came out flat and certain. Not urgent. Urgency was wasted on people who didn't understand what they were hearing. She was already moving toward the crash cart, the one stocked for moments exactly like this, and her hands knew where everything lived because hands remember what brains have trained them to do under fire. Under mortar fire. Under the specific kind of pressure that separates people who can act from people who can only watch. The 14-gauge needle felt familiar in her fingers. Angiocath. The plastic hub was the color of fresh blood. She didn't think about where it came from or what it cost or whether anyone was watching. She located the second intercostal space with 2 fingers, traced the ribs with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd done this in a field hospital in Anbar province with the dust from an explosion still settling on her shoulders. Midclavicular line. The anatomical landmarks hadn't changed. The human body was the same whether you were in a sterile American hospital or crouching beside a stretcher with rounds still snapping overhead. The needle went in smooth and sure. The hiss of air escaping the chest cavity sounded like pressure releasing from a seal, like the planet itself exhaling in relief. Cross's oxygen saturation jumped from 68 on the monitor to 71, 75, 82, climbing like a helicopter gaining altitude. 91. His chest expanded. The dusky blue started receding like a tide. His breathing became something a human chest could manage instead of the desperate gasping of someone drowning on dry land. Ramesh stared at her hands like they'd just performed a resurrection. Which they had. Which they'd done dozens of times before, in places with different names and the same absolute requirement that someone step forward and act. Where did you learn to do that? Ramesh asked. His voice had steadied now that the crisis had passed, now that he could think again, now that he could ask questions instead of just watching someone die. Hannah secured the catheter with practiced efficiency, her fingers moving through the steps of dressing the site with the same precision she'd used to perform the procedure. Tape. Dressing. Documentation ready to flow from muscle memory into the chart. Cover maintained. Identity intact. Just a nurse following textbook protocol. Nothing remarkable. Nothing dangerous. Textbook procedure, she said quietly, and meant it in a way Ramesh would never understand. But Major Cross's eyes were open now. They'd fluttered open somewhere in the middle of the decompression, consciousness clawing back from the edge of nowhere, and he was looking at her hands. Not her face. Her hands. The way they'd moved without hesitation. The absolute certainty in each motion. The kind of technique that didn't come from nursing school or from YouTube videos or from watching colleagues. It came from a specific type of field training, from a specific type of pressure, from a specific type of life lived in places that didn't appear on most American maps. Recognition flickered across his expression. Not the blank recognition of a patient acknowledging a nurse. Something deeper. Something that understood what it had just witnessed. He whispered so quietly that only Hannah heard it, his voice rough from the intubation, from the trauma, from the adrenaline crashing through his system. You served. Hannah's heart stopped. Not metaphorically. Not the kind of thing you said to sound dramatic. Her autonomic nervous system literally stuttered, missed a beat, recognized the statement as a threat to everything she'd constructed in 17 months at Seattle General. The identity. The cover. The reason her handlers had embedded her here in the first place. All of it lived in the assumption that nobody knew. Nobody could know. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the one with the 10th Special Forces Group insignia that hung in her locker like a secret, could stay buried as long as nobody looked too closely, as long as nobody understood what they were seeing. She met his eyes for one dangerous second. Just one. Long enough for him to see that he was right. Long enough for her to confirm what his hands had already recognized in the way her hands had moved. The kind of confirmation that got people killed or extracted, that ended missions or started wars, that turned hospitals into dangerous places where the wrong person knowing the wrong thing could unravel classified operations and 17 months of careful work. Rest, Major, she said, and her voice was steady as surgical steel. She reached down and adjusted the dressing, gave his shoulder the kind of touch that said she understood exactly who he was and what he'd just recognized, and what would happen if either of them acknowledged it again. You're stable now. The monitor beeped its reassuring rhythm. 93 oxygen saturation. Heart rate 120 and dropping as the adrenaline wore off and Cross's body recognized that he'd crossed back from the edge. He was alive. She'd done that. Her hands had done that, the same hands that had been tied in 17 knots over the last 72 hours as Dr. Pierce systematically dismantled her career, posted her failures on unit boards, isolated her from colleagues, written her erasure into documentation that would stick to her personnel file like scar tissue. She turned back to the crash cart to dispose of the needle, to document what she'd done in the evening notes, to create a paper trail that would prove she'd performed an unauthorized procedure without physician supervision, without orders, without the kind of clearance that a civilian nurse was supposed to have. It would be there in black and white. Evidence. The exact thing that would give Dr. Pierce the justification he'd been waiting for. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Major Cross knew. The worst part was that recognition in his eyes, the understanding that he'd just watched a military operative move through a medical crisis with a kind of precision that couldn't be explained by civilian training. The worst part was that everything she'd built was collapsing inward like his chest had been collapsing just moments ago, and there was nothing she could do to stop it except keep moving forward as if nothing had changed, as if the most dangerous person in Seattle General hadn't just figured out exactly who she was. Ramesh was already reaching for his phone to page the attending, to document what had happened, to create the official record. Hannah's hand came up, steady as ever. I'll notify them. You monitor his vitals. Not a request. An order. The voice had changed without her meaning to change it, dropping down into a register that came from somewhere much deeper than a civilian nursing career. Ramesh nodded and stepped back, and Hannah realized that she'd already started the countdown. 3 days. That's what they told her when she arrived 17 months ago. 3 days before the real enemy figures out you're not who you claim to be. The clock had just started ticking. The morning rounds began like every other morning at Seattle General. Dr. Pierce entered room 12 with his white coat pressed sharp as a blade, clipboard tucked under his arm like a weapon he'd learned to use before he'd learned to heal. The Major lay propped on pillows, chest tube draining clear fluid, breathing steady. Pain meds made him drowsy but present. Pierce reviewed the overnight notes, his finger running down the page with the careful precision of a man checking for evidence. Then he stopped. His jaw tightened. Color drained from his face like someone had pulled a plug. He read the entry again. Needle decompression, 0200 hours, performed by RN Clarke, emergency procedure, tension pneumothorax, O2 saturation recovered from 62 to 94%, patient stabilized pending physician review. The Major's signature on the form. A thumbprint. Documentation so clean, so competent, so utterly illegal that it glowed like a neon confession. Pierce's hands trembled. Not with concern. With rage. He didn't speak to the Major. He didn't acknowledge the man's slight nod or the gratitude in his eyes. Pierce simply closed the chart and walked out of room 12 with the gait of someone who'd just discovered a bomb in his basement and needed to disarm it before it detonated. Hannah was at the medication dispensary at 0730, pulling inventory for the shift change, her hand steady and her mind somewhere else entirely. 3 days. That's how long she'd been living in the gap between two identities, the civilian nurse the hospital saw and the captain the Major now knew she was. 3 days of waiting for extraction orders that hadn't come. 3 days of holding a cover story that was dissolving like sugar in water. The intercom crackled. RN Clarke to Dr. Pierce's office. Immediately. The room went very still. Other nurses glanced at her with the familiar look that had become her constant companion, the look that said they'd already decided what came next. Hannah set down the medication cart with the same mechanical care she used for everything now. Muscle memory took over. Left foot first. Right foot second. Hands at her sides. Eyes forward. Pierce's office door was already open. He stood behind his desk, not sitting, the posture of a man preparing for confrontation. A termination letter sat centered on the desk like a contract with hell. 3 months of documentation lay in a folder beside it, papers thick as a manuscript. Hannah recognized the setup. She'd seen it before, in different contexts, in different countries, the architecture of professional execution. Sit, Pierce said. Hannah remained standing. Sitting would be capitulation. Pierce's face darkened. You performed an unauthorized invasive procedure on a patient without physician supervision. You inserted a needle into a human chest cavity. You violated hospital protocol, scope of practice, your job classification, and basic medical law. The patient was dying, Hannah said. Her voice came out level, almost bored. The voice of someone who'd made harder decisions under worse circumstances. The resident was frozen. O2 sat was 62. I had 90 seconds. You had exactly zero authority to act as a surgeon, Captain, Pierce caught himself. His face shifted. For just a moment, his eyes narrowed as if he was seeing something in her posture, her hands, the way she held the space between them. But he pushed through it. You had exactly zero authority to act. And now I have to terminate you before the hospital's liability insurance catches up with us. He slid the letter across the desk. Hannah didn't touch it. I saved his life. The resident will confirm. The resident confirms you violated hospital protocol. Pierce opened the folder. 3 months of incident reports. Witness statements. Policy violation citing obscure regulations about scope of practice and unauthorized medical procedures. Forms she'd never filled out. Incidents she'd never participated in. A paper trail built with the precision of someone who'd been planning this moment since the day she'd started asking questions about those supply invoices. The one showing sutures at $800 a box when market rate ran $260. The one showing scopolamine patches at 10 times cost. The one suggesting a network so profitable it was worth destroying anyone who looked too closely. You've been a problem since you arrived, Clarke, Pierce said quietly. The anger had evaporated from his voice, replaced with something worse, the calm of a man who'd already won. This is a liability issue. Hospitals can't have rogue nurses performing unauthorized surgery. Insurance won't cover it. Families will sue. We simply cannot retain you. Hannah's mind raced through the variables. Blowing her cover meant extraction, getting pulled out with mission failure. The pharmaceutical network would scatter. Pierce would walk away clean. The IT audit her handler requested wouldn't complete for another week. Without her maintaining position, without her having documented access to the procurement records, the evidence chain would break. She was trapped between two oaths. The oath to heal. The oath to serve. I'm requesting a formal review, Hannah said, keeping her voice steady as a cardiac rhythm. An independent investigation into these allegations. Pierce smiled. It was the smile of someone who'd already checked every exit. Request denied. Security will escort you out at end of shift. Badge and ID by 1800. Don't make this difficult. Hannah didn't respond. She turned and walked out of his office with the same composure she'd maintained through 18 months of humiliation, the same composure that had earned her a silver star in Tikrit. She didn't let her hand shake until she was out of sight. She didn't let her face crack until she was in the stairwell, alone. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 0300 hours in an empty diner 3 blocks from Seattle General, the kind of place that existed in that liminal space between night and morning where nobody came anymore. The fluorescent lights hummed an endless mechanical dirge. A single customer sat at the counter nursing black coffee. The waitress read a magazine with her feet up on a stool, moving only to refill Hannah's cup every few minutes even though she hadn't taken a single sip. Hannah stared at her reflection in the dark window. She saw the nurse in the glass, the tired face, the scrubs, the ID badge she'd surrendered at shift change and then picked up again because protocols required it. She saw a woman who'd spent 18 months invisible, holding 2 identities like a schizophrenic prayer, waiting for a home country that seemed to have forgotten she existed. Her phone stayed dark. No extraction order. No backup plan. No voice on the other end of the secure line saying, "We've got you, Reaper. Come home." Just the weight of choosing between her oath as a nurse, to do no harm, to help the helpless, and her duty as an intelligence officer, to complete the mission, to end a network that was funneling diverted military pharmaceuticals into civilian black markets, destabilizing supply chains for hospitals across 3 states. Pain was information. She'd learned that in combat. Physical pain meant you were still alive. Emotional pain meant you still had something to lose. The coffee was cold. The window reflected her face like a mirror into a different life, one where she'd never put on the uniform, never taken the oath, never learned to see through the civilian camouflage at people like Dr. Pierce. She pulled out her phone. The Pentagon handlers had a protocol for this, a kill switch, a safe word, an extraction trigger that would bring the helicopter within 20 minutes. 1 word and it was over. Her thumb hovered over the unlock button. 3 years of work. 14 identified suppliers. 9 suspected murders disguised as medical errors. 217,000 doses of controlled pharmaceuticals moving through hospital networks toward organized crime networks with ties to everything from gang warfare to international trafficking. And Pierce was going to walk. Unless she could still stop him. Hannah set the phone down. Stared at her reflection. The woman in the glass had a faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the 10th Special Forces Group insignia, the only piece of her real identity she'd kept close enough to touch. She'd worn it for 18 months under civilian scrubs. She'd survived on it like a lifeline, like a promise that somebody, somewhere, still knew who she was. The cold coffee sat untouched. The night stretched out ahead of her like a problem with no solution. But problems were just questions that hadn't been asked correctly yet. And Hannah Clarke had spent her entire adult life learning to ask the right questions under circumstances that would have broken anyone else. She picked up the cold coffee and drank it anyway. 3 days after Hannah Clarke saved his life, Major Cross opened his eyes in the pre-dawn darkness of the ICU and whispered one word that cut through 18 months of careful invisibility like a sniper's round through glass. Reaper. That was all. Just her call sign from Tikrit, breathed across the oxygen mask, a single word that told her everything had changed. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The ventilator wheezed. And somewhere in the ICU, the last thread of her cover snapped. She didn't move toward him. She didn't acknowledge the word. Instead, she finished logging the night shift vitals and turned away, her hand steady as surgical steel, her jaw clenched so tight she could taste blood. But she knew. The Major knew. And within hours, everyone would know. The morning shift arrived at 0600. Hannah was restocking the supply cart when the first boots hit the tile, deliberate, synchronized steps that didn't belong to any hospital staff. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The sound was unmistakable. Military bearing. Chain of command. The kind of presence that made the air pressure change. When she finally glanced toward room 12, a Marine lieutenant stood at the bedside in dress uniform, his cover under one arm, reading from a citation in a voice that carried through the entire ICU. The other nurses stopped what they were doing. Monitors beeped. Somewhere a ventilator wheezed. But the lieutenant's voice cut through all of it with surgical precision. Captain Hannah Clarke. He paused between each line, letting the words settle like stones. For extraordinary valor during Operation Phantom Fury, Tikrit, in the face of enemy fire, demonstrating exceptional medical competence and tactical leadership under circumstances that would have incapacitated ordinary personnel. Another pause. Silver Star. The citation continued, but the room had already gone electric. Silver Star. Not commendation. Not achievement medal. The third highest combat decoration in the entire military. Hannah kept her expression flat, kept restocking supplies as if the Marine lieutenant wasn't reciting the resume of her secret life to an audience of stunned nurses. And then the doors opened again. A 2-star general in full dress uniform entered the ICU ward. His ribbons covered his chest like a map of decades in service, colors Hannah recognized from her own hidden medals, each stripe a story of deployments and hard choices. He walked directly to Hannah at the supply cart and rendered a crisp salute, his fist moving to his chest in the formal military gesture of respect. Not to the patient. To her. To the woman in scrubs whose name had been buried so deep under layers of civilian identity that she'd almost forgotten it herself. When he lowered his hand, his eyes held a message. The game was over? She was seen. Captain Clarke. His voice was rough as diesel fuel. Welcome home. Dr. Pierce appeared in the ICU doorway at that exact moment, his white coat pristine, his face already shifting into complaint mode. The administrator's termination letter was probably still warm in his briefcase. He'd been planning his victory lap, the official erasure of the insubordinate nurse who'd questioned his supply orders. He saw the general. He saw the Marine lieutenant. He saw the citation lying on the bedside table with Hannah Clarke's full military rank printed in capital letters. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Excuse me, General, I need to clarify that this nurse was terminated yesterday for scope of practice violations. Pierce stepped forward, his voice the same condescending rasp he'd used 1,000 times before. The voice that had cleared rooms and shattered careers of people who couldn't fight back. The general's aide, a captain with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, moved with the fluid precision of someone trained to recognize threats. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. 2 federal agents in the hallway would like to speak with you about your procurement practices, Dr. Pierce. Now would be optimal. It wasn't a request. It was a command. The captain's hand gestured toward the door with the polite firmness of someone who'd escorted hostile detainees out of forward operating bases. Pierce's face went the color of wet concrete. Behind the captain, 2 agents in dark suits were already moving toward the elevator, and Pierce understood instantly that he was walking straight into an interrogation. He didn't move. He was calculating, trying to figure if he had time to make a phone call to activate whatever network of allies he'd cultivated. The hospital administrator appeared behind the agents, his face ashen. The look of a man who'd just realized his entire hospital was about to be investigated. They took Pierce to the administrator's office on the 3rd floor. Hannah heard about it later, piece by piece, the way news travels in hospitals faster than blood types through a transfusion line. Marcus Webb was waiting in that office, a Navy veteran who'd spent 20 years in IT before taking a hospital job, the kind of quiet man who worked in the background while everyone else made noise. Webb had been the one who noticed something wrong with the supply deletion logs 3 months ago. A skilled someone had wiped records from the inventory system, but they hadn't understood that deletion isn't the same as erasure. Every keystroke gets logged. Every file deletion leaves a ghost in the database. Webb had been documenting everything since. When Pierce walked in, Webb was standing beside the administrator's desk with a hard drive in one hand and a laptop with a single screen visible. The footage began playing. Dr. Pierce at 0230 in the morning, accessing the hospital's procurement system. Dr. Pierce using administrator credentials he shouldn't have had, modifying purchase orders, changing dates, deleting evidence. The timestamps marched across the screen like a trial. And then another camera angle. Dr. Pierce in the parking garage at 2300 hours, meeting a man with a scarred neck and patient eyes. The man's name appeared on the screen in federal database photos. Vincent Morales. Distribution network for diverted military pharmaceuticals. 2 years under surveillance. Millions in stolen goods. And Dr. Pierce taking an envelope from Morales' hand, accepting his cut. You tried to delete the records, Webb said quietly. His voice didn't carry anger, just fact. I saved every frame. Every keystroke. Every meeting. Another clip played. Dr. Pierce on his phone, speaking to someone about the nurse problem, about building documentation to fire Hannah before she could file a report about the supply discrepancies. Webb had that too. The agents presented warrants. Pierce's medical license was flagged for immediate suspension. His hospital privileges were revoked before he could even make the elevator. The man who'd spent 18 months systematically destroying careers found his own career erased in the time it took to watch security footage. As he was escorted out through the ICU, past the nurses who'd once feared him, past the machines that beeped in indifferent rhythm, past Hannah standing in her restored captain's uniform with her rank insignia suddenly visible on her collar, Pierce tried to speak. No one listened. The elevator doors closed. He was gone. Hannah found Marcus Webb in the hallway outside the ICU. He was still holding the hard drive, the physical evidence of his documentation. She shook his hand. His grip was firm but his eyes were tired. Thank you, she said. The words felt insufficient. They were. I recognized the suture pattern on the major, Webb replied. The 3-layer technique. My son served with the 10th Special Forces Group in Helmand. He told me about a medic they called Reaper. Said she saved his whole squad in Jolan district. Webb paused. Didn't take much after that. The math was pretty simple. The network collapsed within 72 hours. 7 arrests across Norfolk and 2 surrounding counties. For $0.3 million in recovered pharmaceuticals. Falsified invoices traced back to suppliers who'd been inflating costs for 18 months, feeding kickbacks up a chain that led directly to Vincent Morales and 3 hospital administrators. Pierce's carefully constructed paper trail, the one he'd built to destroy Hannah, became the evidence used to convict him instead. The irony was so complete it might have been poetic if it hadn't involved the theft of medications meant for soldiers coming home from war. 6 months later, Hannah stood outside a cafe on Granby Street in Norfolk, watching through the window as Dr. Pierce loaded cardboard boxes into a white van marked MedTemp staffing. No white coat. No credentials hanging around his neck. No authority. Just a man with diminished prospects taking whatever work an agency would offer to someone with a revoked license and a federal investigation pending trial. The boxes were light. He handled them without purpose. When someone was fired, when someone's career had been systematically deconstructed by evidence and documentation, there wasn't much left to carry. Hannah watched him load the last box. He didn't look up. He didn't know she was watching. That afternoon, she walked through Seattle General in her captain's uniform for the first time since her assignment began. The collar felt different now, not like concealment but like recognition. The ICU staff moved differently around her. The nurses who'd cleared out of the break room when she sat down now waved respectfully. The young resident who'd frozen during the major's pneumothorax now stepped aside to let her pass. Room 12 held a new patient, recovering well, his monitors showing the steady progression of healing. She didn't stop. She had somewhere else to be. The ceremony was brief. The hospital administrator, the new one, temporarily assigned while the investigation concluded, presented Hannah with a civilian commendation for her undercover work. As she stood at the podium accepting the award, she saw Major Cross in the back row in his Class A uniform, his chest still bearing the scars of his injury but his eyes clear. He nodded. She nodded back. They'd saved each other. The mission was complete. Marcus Webb stood in the corner near the back exit, arms crossed, the faintest smile on his weathered face. The quietest person in the room. The one who'd held everything together with documentation and patience while everyone else made noise. Hannah caught his eye and inclined her head in respect. Webb understood what that gesture meant. He'd been running his own kind of operation all along, collecting evidence the way Hannah collected intelligence. Different tools. Same discipline. That evening, Hannah returned to her apartment on the corner of East Freemason and Bausch Street. She'd kept the place minimal during her assignment, a bed, a chair, nothing personal. Now she unpacked the boxes that had arrived from her actual life. The faded unit patch from her 10th group jacket, the one she'd kept sewn inside her lining since Tikrit, went into a frame on the wall beside her silver star. Two pieces of her identity, finally allowed to exist in the same space. Her phone rang at 1900 hours. Her Pentagon handler. New assignment, Captain. There's a situation in San Diego involving diverted weapons inventory. We need someone with your profile. Hannah looked at her reflection in the window, no longer fractured, no longer invisible. The woman looking back was whole. Send the briefing, she said. When do I leave? Some people fight battles everyone can see. They wear uniforms to work. They carry rank on their shoulders. But there are others, the quiet ones, the invisible ones, the ones who operate in the spaces between official records, who fight the wars that never make headlines. They restore order in the dark. They save lives in plain sight while pretending to be ordinary. And if you're very lucky, you'll never know they were there at all. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever seen someone underestimated and proved wrong, hit that subscribe button. Like this video. And comment, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong?